I mean, if you go to the eye level in the water and you put a stick into it, the stick looks like it's bent. It looks like there's two sticks, but there's really just one. It just bends the light as it goes into the water. Your senses are not always accurate. So they'll say, well, my senses are accurate 99% of the time. Well, the question then is, how do you know that they're accurate 99% of the time? What method did you use to determine your senses were accurate? Well, they used their senses to determine their senses were valid. Wrong. This is logical error, logical flaw. This is one of the worst foundations you can possibly stand on to say, I sense my senses are valid. Because you've got a rubber ruler problem. Let's take an example. Say I was going to take this tape measure, okay? And I want to find out if this tape measure has an accurate inch, okay, a standard inch on it. So what I do to find out is I bend the tape measure over and I measure an inch to an inch. And I say, oh, well, the inches seem to line up the same, so it must be a standard inch. That is what we refer to as stupid, okay? Let me define stupid for you. Stupid. Lacking ordinary quickness and keenness of mind. Dull, foolish, senseless, okay? That means it doesn't have any logical merit to it at all. So, if you're trying to use your senses to determine your senses are valid, it's the same thing as trying to use the measuring tool you're using to measure itself to make sure that the measurement is accurate. It's always going to be accurate. It's a rubber ruler problem. So, this is completely based, Ayn Rand's philosophy on objectivism is completely based on logical flaw. You could prove that for anything. This is no truth to be, I mean, I would definitely not, if you believe Ayn Rand's philosophy on objectivism is true and therefore you're rejecting God, I would not base my eternity on something as flimsy as that by any means. I really don't think we've got any time to cover that any further. I know it's very general and I'm sure there's a lot more people that would like a lot more detail. I'm happy to give it and I may cover that in future videos, but this, we just don't have time to go into that too much further. But what he does here is simply atrocious. He turns this around and says that you can't violate anybody's rights because of this non-aggression principle. Well, he refers the non-aggression principle to Ayn Rand's philosophy on objectivism. And Ayn Rand's philosophy on objectivism simply refers to, I sense my senses are valid. So he's referring that no one can violate anybody's rights based on that his senses. I feel this is the right thing to do, so therefore it's right. And you can see this in the same thing as some of the comments and YouTube video responses I've received on my videos. They do the same thing. They say, well, I feel like this is the right thing to do. No, it doesn't work that way. So then he goes down to, and this is where it gets, man, this just gets worse as it goes along. Then he tries to reference that to, he says, this principle has been articulated with very little variation by all the writers in the liberal tradition. Now, what is the liberal tradition? He doesn't define that in here either. I would like Tom to define that before he starts including authors in with his definition that he makes very vague and never defines of the liberal tradition. But he includes Locke, Jefferson, Paine, Bastiat, Mill, and I don't even know who Mill is. I guess he assumes that all the people reading this are supposed to know who Mill is, but he never references to who this Mill person is in anywhere else I've read so far. And then he says in later, Rand, from what we just discussed, and other 20th century writers and thinkers. You know what? This principle that he's talking about, articulated with very little variation, Locke certainly does not do that, Jefferson does not do that, and Bastiat doesn't do that. Those are 3 of the 6 that he gives, I know full well, do not do that. So is Tom ignorant or is he lying? I haven't determined that yet. But I will say this, well, I'll save that for the end. We'll talk about that at the end of this. Then he says, by applying this principle, most complicated societal issues become astoundingly simple. No, they don't, Tom. I can argue. I mean, if we leave out God, and I argue on the side of the New World Order, because they leave God out of what they're doing too, it's your opinion versus theirs. So who's right, you or them? And you can, push it off to, well, I feel this is. Well, it's still your opinion. What you feel is still your opinion. Okay? You can feel, for example, you can feel like abortion is okay. Other people can feel like abortion's wrong. So who's right? Well, then, I've even heard some people say, well, how would you feel if that was done to you? if the baby doesn't feel it. Well, what if a baby is born paralyzed from the neck down? Just let's say, for instance, and you went in and ripped their body parts apart like they do in a lot of the abortions. They'll take a hook in and rip parts of the baby out. And if that disgusts some of you, well, that's how it's done, and that'll anger you to get something done about it. But let's say that the baby didn't feel it. Then would it be okay to murder the baby? How could you argue that? You're basing it on what you feel is a flimsy argument. It's a, you got a rubber ruler problem. So then he goes, he says, the ambiguous becomes unambiguous. The answers become clear. Well, Tom, you can state this like a mantra all you want, but that is not going to make it true. Saying something over and over again just doesn't make it true. Okay? Facing every problem this way. And he says, America today can be solved. The problems in America today can be solved by applying this principle of freedom. He's saying it right here. He's saying that this principle of freedom that he's talking about is that I sense my senses are valid. He's saying that this principle of freedom is Ayn Rand's philosophy on objectivism. That's where he gets this from. This is one of the most pathetic arguments I've ever seen for anything, Tom. You folks need to go in and read that Revealing Liberty, a defining line in the sand, read the definitions between freedom and liberty, and then see which side you're on. That's why I wrote a defining line in the sand. Tom is definitely on the side of freedom. This is the New Ager, communistic version of what real liberty is. Liberty by God, which is what it's supposed to be. Liberty by God is exactly what we had at this country's inception. Today, we don't have that at all. And what these people are trying to do is the same mistake that the French made during their revolution. I mean, Frederick Bastiat wrote about that in The Law, which is even quoted in this book, and Tom Mullen never talks about that. I'm wondering if Tom Mullen even read Frederick Bastiat's The Law. I would question that based on what I've seen here. Because Frederick Bastiat clearly states, he says, I've got the book right over here, he says that it is God that determines law. That's where we get our laws from. He very clearly states that, and he says, particularly at the end of his book, there's no way we can get real liberty without God. De Tocqueville, who wrote the Democracy in America book long ago, he said that the one thing that was missing, he said the secret, he came over here from France to see what we did differently, because he said something they're doing in America is much different than we did in France, because in France we tried to do the same thing they did and we failed. They walked right back into the tyranny they started with. And when he came over here to do research, he went back, wrote this book. Now he called it Democracy in America, even though he had that idea wrong. He did conclude, he said, the reason America is great, he says, I looked everywhere. He says it wasn't in their commerce, it wasn't in any of these things. He listed a whole bunch of things. He said the secret is because their pulpits and their churches were aflame with righteousness. He says America is great because America is good. And if she ever stops being good, she will stop being great. If you guys haven't read even just that portion of de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, you need to read that and figure out what exactly made this country great. Okay? It wasn't the Constitution, I'll tell you that. The Constitution played a part, but that wasn't the foundation that it's set upon. And I think a lot of people need to get their priorities straight. Now the thing is, he references that principle of freedom. Here's the part where I talked about, continuing on, he says, rights mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, he says, are drawn out of Locke's philosophy, and they're unalienable. Well, first of all, Tom, Locke's philosophy is drawn from this book right here, the Holy Bible. Okay, he says specifically it's from the Scriptures and it's from the will of God that his philosophy is drawn from. Then you're turning around and trying to say that you can have that the Declaration of Independence was drawn on Locke's philosophy, and you try to claim that Locke, from your other writings, I've seen you do this before, trying to claim that Locke was being able to justify this without God. I want to know if you actually read Locke's work. I would like, I'll be happy to debate Tom Mullen on this in a public setting. I have no problem with that. But I really want to know if he's actually read this material or not.